I was 18, 7 months pregnant, barefoot on the cracked concrete porch of our rental house in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when my husband locked the door and smiled at me through the glass. Daniel Hayes was 25, broad-shouldered and steady, the kind of man who looked dependable in church and decisive in business meetings. Under the porch light, he didn't look angry. He looked certain. He set my suitcase down beside me like it was something that no longer belonged inside. Then I heard the deadbolt slide into place. "You'll be back," he mouthed. I remember the sound more than the words. That small metallic click. Final. Clean. I had $38 in my purse. My phone battery was low. My name wasn't on the lease because Daniel had said it was simpler that way. My family was 3 states away in Arkansas, and the baby inside me kicked hard, as if he understood betrayal before he ever took his first breath. Daniel believed pregnancy made me dependent. He believed financial control was love. He believed that locking me out would make me collapse, knock on that door, and beg to be let back in. He had no idea that the moment he locked that door, he handed me the first piece of evidence that would change everything. The air felt colder than it should have for early fall. My bare feet pressed into the rough concrete, and I became aware of how exposed I was. The porch light flickered. Somewhere down the street a dog barked. A curtain across the way shifted slightly. People were watching, but no one stepped in. Inside the house, I could see Daniel moving through the living room like nothing had happened. He picked up his phone, sat down on the couch, turned on the television. Calm, controlled, as if this was a lesson I needed to learn. 2 hours earlier, we had been standing in that same living room arguing about money. I had asked to see the bank statements for his construction business. He had laughed at first, then hardened. He told me I didn't understand how expansion worked, that I worried too much, that I should focus on being grateful I didn't have to work anymore. When I pushed, he snapped. "You're already costing me enough," he said, glancing at my stomach. "Do you have any idea what this timing does to my plans?" My plans. My pregnancy? My fault. He admitted he had moved company funds into a new account under a separate LLC. Protection, he called it. I asked protection from what? He didn't answer. He told me I was emotional, hormonal, dramatic. Then he grabbed my suitcase from the closet and dragged it across the floor. Back on the porch, I wrapped my arms around myself and tried to think clearly. Betrayal has a strange way of sharpening the mind. I opened my purse. Driver's license. Prenatal appointment card. $38 in wrinkled bills. A nearly dead phone. For a moment, I considered knocking. Just once. Swallowing my pride. Promising to stop asking questions. But I looked at his reflection in the glass. He wasn't worried. He wasn't even angry anymore. He was confident. He believed he had secured his future by cutting me out of it. That was the moment something shifted in me. Instead of knocking, I stepped back from the door. I scrolled through my contacts. My mother's name glowed on the screen. I hovered over it. Shame rose in my throat. I had insisted this marriage was solid, that Daniel was ambitious, not controlling, that I was fine. Then I kept scrolling. A billboard I passed every week near the county courthouse flashed in my memory. A local family attorney who advertised fiercely about protecting women in divorce and custody battles. Daniel once mocked those ads. Said only vindictive wives called lawyers. My thumb stopped on the number I had saved months earlier. Quietly. Without telling him. The battery icon blinked red as I stepped off the porch and walked toward the edge of the driveway for better signal. Gravel bit into my feet. I didn't look back at the house. The line rang twice before a recorded message offered an after-hours emergency option. I pressed it. A woman answered. Calm and alert. I swallowed and forced my voice to steady. My husband locked me out. I said, "I'm 7 months pregnant. My name isn't on the lease, but I have access to some of his financial records." There was a brief pause. Then she said she would page the attorney on call. As I stood under the streetlight, the porch light behind me flickered again. The house that had felt like security just hours earlier now looked like a sealed vault. And for the first time that night, I realized something clearly. I wasn't trying to get back inside that house anymore. I was preparing to make sure he would answer for locking me out of it. The shelter intake office smelled like old coffee and disinfectant, and I remember thinking how strange it was that safety could feel so temporary. I sat on a faded floral couch, one hand resting on my stomach, the other gripping a clipboard that asked me to check boxes next to words like emotional abuse, financial control, and housing instability. I hesitated for half a second before marking them. Saying it out loud had been hard enough. Writing it down made it real. My husband locked me out. I told the intake coordinator, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a steady voice. I'm 7 months pregnant. She didn't look shocked. She looked practiced. That scared me more than anything. An hour later, my phone buzzed. The attorney had returned the call. His voice was calm, deliberate. He asked for details. Whose name was on the lease? Who paid the bills? Whether we had joint accounts. My name isn't on the lease, I admitted. He said it was easier that way. And the business? He asked. Do you have any documentation connected to his construction company? I closed my eyes and pictured the kitchen counter, where Daniel used to leave stacks of invoices. I had sorted them sometimes, just to feel useful. I knew vendor names. I knew approximate monthly revenue. I knew more than he thought I did. I might, I said carefully. He explained my immediate reality. Without my name on the lease, I couldn't legally force entry that night. But marital assets were another matter. If income had been shifted, concealed, or transferred to avoid shared liability, that could change everything. Start gathering proof, he said. Quietly. Proof. The next morning, after barely sleeping in a narrow shelter bed, I logged into our shared email account. Daniel had forgotten one thing in his rush to erase me from the house. He had not changed the password yet. Confirmation emails flooded the inbox. A new bank account opened under a freshly registered LLC. Large transfers labeled Operational Realignment. A line of credit approved just 2 weeks earlier. The transfers began before the argument, before the lockout, before he accused me of ruining his plans. This wasn't emotional. It was calculated. I forwarded every email to a new address I created that morning. Then I changed the password to our shared account before logging out. For the first time since stepping onto that porch, I felt something close to control. As I scrolled deeper, I found an attachment that made my hands go cold. A guarantee agreement tied to the new LLC's line of credit. My name was listed as co-guarantor. I didn't remember signing that. 3 weeks earlier, Daniel had slid a stack of papers across the table after dinner. Routine refinancing, he said casually. Just restructuring some vendor terms. I had been tired, nauseous, trusting. I signed where he pointed. Now I stared at a scanned signature that looked like mine, but felt foreign. The date matched that night. My breath shortened. If the company defaulted, I could be liable for thousands in debt I didn't even know existed. This wasn't just betrayal. It was financial entrapment. Daniel texted that afternoon. When you're done being dramatic, come home. A second message followed. I already told my parents you ran off. I read the words twice. He wasn't worried. He was rewriting the story. I didn't respond. I screenshotted the messages and added them to my new digital folder labeled simply Evidence. The shelter caseworker helped me apply for emergency assistance, food benefits, prenatal clinic referrals. I swallowed my pride and signed every form. Independence, I realized, begins with accepting help strategically. That evening, the attorney called again. I explained the new LLC, the transfers, the guarantee agreement. He went quiet for a moment. If your signature was forged or obtained under misrepresentation, he said slowly, that changes the exposure significantly. Exposure. Legal language felt cold, but it felt solid, structured, predictable. Unlike Daniel's moods. Forward me everything, he said. And do not confront him about this yet. I promised I wouldn't. After the call, I sat on the edge of the shelter bed, and placed both hands over my stomach. The baby shifted beneath my palms, steady and alive. Daniel believed he had secured his empire by cutting me out before I could claim a share. He believed pregnancy made me dependent and uninformed. He didn't realize that by locking me out. He forced me to look at numbers I had ignored, contracts I had trusted, accounts I had never questioned. The lock on that door had been loud, but the paper trail he left behind was louder, and I was done being the only one who didn't know how to read it. My water broke at 3 a.m. on a thin mattress in the shelter, and for a second I thought it was just another nightmare. The pain came fast and sharp, folding me in half. One of the staff members drove me to the county hospital in Tulsa, while I tried to breathe through contractions and hold on to whatever calm I had left. The fluorescent lights in the emergency entrance felt too bright, too exposing. I remember gripping the edge of the wheelchair and thinking, this is not how I imagined becoming a mother. By the time they admitted me, someone had already contacted Daniel. Legally. He was still my husband. He walked into the delivery room looking composed, hair neatly combed, concern carefully arranged across his face. He carried flowers. There she is, he said softly, as if we were a normal couple about to welcome our first child. The nurse smiled at him. He squeezed my hand for show. I didn't pull away. I didn't have the energy. But I watched him closely. Between contractions, he leaned toward a nurse and said, she's been under a lot of stress lately. Emotional. I'm just trying to keep things stable. Emotional. There it was again. The quiet narrative he had been building. When the paperwork came, he reached for the folder before I did. I'll handle it, he said automatically. No, I replied, breath shaking but voice steady. I'll read it. He hesitated for just a second too long before letting go. Labor blurred time. Pain came in waves that erased everything except survival. And then, just before dawn, my son cried for the first time. They placed him on my chest, warm and fragile and impossibly real. I looked down at his tiny face and felt something shift inside me that had nothing to do with fear. No one would use him as leverage. Not ever. Daniel stood beside the bed, staring at the baby like he was evaluating an asset. We'll figure this out, he said quietly. But his eyes were already calculating. A week after I was discharged back to the shelter, I was served with temporary custody papers. Daniel had filed for joint physical custody, claiming I lacked stable housing and financial resources. He argued that he could provide a secure environment through his business income and family support. My attorney didn't look surprised. He's trying to establish primary influence early, he said. We respond immediately. The shelter address suddenly felt like a weakness instead of protection. I spent nights nursing my newborn while drafting timelines of every incident, every text, every financial discrepancy. I was exhausted. But exhaustion no longer meant surrender. In family court, the room felt smaller than I expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights, a judge who looked like she had seen every version of this story before. Daniel's lawyer spoke first. My client operates a successful construction business and has stable housing. The mother is currently residing in transitional accommodation. Transitional accommodation. As if survival were a character flaw. My attorney stood and introduced evidence of recent fund transfers into a newly formed LLC, along with the questionable guarantee agreement listing me as co-guarantor. There was a murmur in the courtroom when the bank statements were submitted. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel's father, who had been sitting stiffly in the back row, requested permission to speak. He admitted that company funds had been moved without full internal approval, that certain financial decisions had not been disclosed to extended family investors. Daniel's jaw tightened. For the first time since that night on the porch, I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. The judge leaned forward. Financial transparency will be required, she said evenly. Temporary primary physical custody will remain with the mother pending further review. The father will have scheduled visitation. It wasn't a final victory, but it was a crack in the wall he had built. Back at the shelter that night, I sat in the dim light while my son slept against my chest. My body ached. My mind raced. The attorney called just before midnight. "There's something else," he said. "Preliminary review suggests your signature on that guarantee may not match your standard signing pattern. Forgery. If proven, it could mean civil penalties. Serious consequences." I looked down at my son's tiny hand wrapped around my finger and understood something with complete clarity. This was no longer about getting back inside a house. This was about making sure no one ever used ignorance as a weapon against me again. He thought the courtroom would intimidate me. He thought motherhood would slow me down. He didn't know that every document he forged, every dollar he shifted, every lie he told was teaching me how to read the system he relied on. And I was learning fast. 2 years later, I was 21, living in a small 2-bedroom apartment in Dallas, Texas, with a toddler who liked to line up toy trucks across the living room floor. The shelter was behind me. The courtroom battles had settled into a tense routine of scheduled visitations and stiff exchanges in parking lots. Daniel still spoke to me like I was temporary, like I would eventually fold. But I wasn't folding anymore. I was studying during the day. I worked part-time at a modest bookkeeping firm owned by a meticulous CPA named Harold Whitman. He was in his early 60s. Gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses. The kind of man who believed numbers told the truth if you listened long enough. At night, after I put my son to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with accounting textbooks spread around me. Debits, credits, balance sheets, cash flow statements. At first it felt like learning a foreign language. Then it started to feel like power. Money no longer scared me. It started to make sense. One afternoon, Harold handed me a stack of files from a mid-sized construction client. "Reconcile these vendor payments," he said. "They're sloppy." I opened the ledger and felt something click. Inflated subcontractor invoices. Rapid transfers between related entities. Short-term loans paid off with new loans. Cash advances disguised as equipment expenses. I had seen this structure before. Daniel used to talk about moving money before anyone noticed. He would sit at the kitchen table late at night, laptop open, explaining how liquidity had to stay fluid. I didn't understand then. I just nodded. Now I understood. This wasn't innovation. It was exposure waiting to happen. I didn't say Daniel's name out loud. I didn't need to. But the pattern was the same. When I handed the reconciled file back to Harold, he studied my notes longer than usual. "You've got a good eye," he said quietly, "especially for construction accounts." I hesitated, then told him my ex-husband owned a construction company. Harold didn't ask for details. He just leaned back in his chair. "Information is leverage," he said. "But leverage without discipline is just revenge. Decide which one you want." The word revenge hung in the air. I told myself I wasn't chasing revenge. I was chasing stability. For my son. For myself. But somewhere beneath that was a memory of a porch light flickering and a door locking. A few months later, local news broke a story about a regional construction supplier under federal audit for tax discrepancies. The segment mentioned irregular subcontractor billing and aggressive credit expansion. One of the subcontractors listed on screen was a company Daniel had proudly posted about partnering with on social media. I didn't react publicly. I didn't text him. I didn't smile. I opened the state business registry website instead. Daniel's new LLC had expanded aggressively over the past year. Multiple lines of credit, equipment financing, vendor-backed loans. The growth looked impressive from the outside. From the inside, it looked fragile. Leverage ratios were stretched. If one contract stalled, the whole structure could tilt. That evening, Daniel called about a minor scheduling conflict for visitation. His tone was clipped. "You still doing that little bookkeeping job?" he asked. "Yes," I said calmly. "And studying?" He laughed softly. "Well, some of us are actually building things." I let him talk. I let him believe I was still behind. After we hung up, I documented the call like I documented everything else. Not because I needed ammunition, because I needed clarity. A week later, Harold called me into his office again. A federal investigator had reached out to the firm requesting expert consultation on bookkeeping irregularities in construction accounts across North Texas. Preliminary review only. Quiet. You've got experience with the structure, Harold said. Under my supervision. You can assist. For a moment, my chest tightened. This wasn't personal. This was professional. Ethical lines mattered. But the industry patterns were familiar in ways that made my pulse steady rather than panicked. I nodded. That night, after putting my son to bed, I stood by the window of my apartment and looked out at the city lights. Dallas felt bigger than Tulsa, fuller of possibility. 2 years earlier, I had stood barefoot on cold concrete believing my life was ending. Now I was holding files that mapped out the architecture of financial empires. Daniel thought he had secured his future by cutting me out before I could claim a share. He didn't realize that by locking me out. He forced me to learn the language of the system he trusted. And once you understand the language of money, you stop being afraid of the men who hide behind it. The Thanksgiving invitation arrived in a cream-colored envelope with Daniel's mother's familiar handwriting across the front. I stood in my Dallas kitchen holding it longer than necessary, my son tugging at my leg while toy cars crashed into cabinet doors behind me. I hadn't sat at the same table as Daniel since the custody hearing. Our exchanges had been limited to parking lots and brief handoffs. Still, I opened it. Family Thanksgiving. The card read, "It would mean a lot if you and Ethan came." Mean a lot to who? I wondered. By then, Daniel had remarried. His new wife, Melissa, came from a polished suburban family with money and connections. Social media showed smiling holiday photos, new development projects, ribbon cuttings. His construction company appeared to be thriving. But I knew how to read balance sheets now. Expansion didn't always mean stability. I drove to Tulsa that Thursday morning with Ethan in the back seat, rehearsing nothing and everything at once. I told myself I wasn't going to defend my life. I wasn't going to argue. I was simply going to observe. Daniel's mother's house looked exactly the same as it had years before. Manicured lawn. Polished front door. Windows shining. Inside, everything felt staged for harmony. Silverware aligned perfectly. Candles flickering. Turkey already resting on the counter. Daniel greeted us in the foyer. "Hey," he said. Too casual. "Glad you made it." He introduced me to a few extended relatives as Ethan's mom. Nothing more. Not my name. Not his former wife. Just a role. I smiled politely. Melissa stood beside him, elegant and composed. She studied me with polite curiosity, like she was trying to reconcile the version of me she'd been told about with the woman standing in front of her. At the dinner table, conversation drifted toward business. Contracts. New developments. Market growth in North Texas. Daniel leaned back in his chair, carving turkey with deliberate ease. "It's been a big year," he said. "We've expanded into commercial projects. Had to restructure some internal financing. But that's how growth works. Restructure. Internal financing." My fork paused midair. An uncle asked me what I'd been up to. "Oh, just bookkeeping," Daniel said lightly before I could answer. "Keeps her busy." A few relatives chuckled politely. I placed my fork down carefully. "I'm finishing my CPA requirements," I said evenly. "Mostly working with construction accounts these days." There was a brief silence. Daniel's eyes flicked toward me. Something sharper behind them. "That so," he said. "Yes," I replied. "It's amazing what you can learn once you start looking closely at the numbers." Melissa glanced between us, sensing something unspoken. As the meal continued, Daniel boasted about a large commercial development his company had recently secured. Aggressive timelines, tight margins, vendor-backed credit. Each detail sounded impressive on the surface. Underneath, I could hear the strain. Over-leveraged expansion, heavy reliance on subcontractors, short-term liquidity covering long-term exposure. He was building fast. Too fast. In the kitchen, Daniel's mother pulled me aside while refilling a serving dish. "Is he stable?" she asked quietly. "Financially. The question hung in the air. I don't have access to his current books, I said carefully. But rapid growth can be risky. She nodded, worry flickering across her face. He's been asking family to co-sign additional loans, she whispered. Says it's temporary. Temporary? Back at the table, Daniel raised his glass. To fresh starts, he said. And people learning to stand on their own. The words were pointed. I met his gaze without flinching. You taught me the importance of financial independence, I said calmly. For that, I'm grateful. The silence this time was heavier. Melissa's expression changed. Subtle, but noticeable. Halfway through dessert, my phone buzzed in my lap. An unknown number. He's under preliminary audit review. Don't react. My pulse slowed instead of spiking. I didn't look at Daniel. I didn't change my expression. I slid the phone back into my purse and reached for my son's coat. We left before pie was served. Outside, the November air felt sharp against my skin. Daniel followed us onto the porch. What are you playing at? He asked quietly, his composure thinner now. Nothing, I said. I'm just living my life. He studied me for a long moment. Stay out of my business, he said. I adjusted Ethan's jacket and buckled him into his car seat. I already am, I replied. As I drove away from that house, I realized something that felt almost surreal. Years earlier, I had stood outside a door he controlled, believing my future was locked behind it. Now I was watching his carefully constructed image from the outside, and I could see the cracks forming in the foundation. That Thanksgiving, I understood that I wasn't surviving him anymore. I was waiting for the numbers to finish telling their story. Harold called me into his office early on a Monday morning, and I knew before he spoke that something had shifted. A formal audit notice had been issued to multiple construction firms across North Texas. It wasn't public yet, but it would be. The inquiry focused on irregular subcontractor billing, aggressive credit expansion, and potential misstatements in financial disclosures. One of the flagged subcontractors was directly tied to Daniel's largest commercial project. I kept my face neutral. Harold folded his hands on the desk. Before we go any further, I need to know if there's a conflict of interest. My ex-husband owns one of the connected companies, I said evenly. He studied me for a long moment. Can you remain professional? Yes. He nodded once. You'll assist under supervision. Limited scope. Documentation review only. It wasn't revenge. It was work. I sat at my desk that afternoon, surrounded by ledgers and vendor contracts. The patterns were familiar. Inflated invoices cycling between related entities. Short-term bridge loans masking liquidity gaps. Payments structured to look like operational costs rather than debt service. It wasn't sloppy. It was ambitious. Too ambitious. Daniel had always believed momentum could outrun exposure. I flagged discrepancies without emotion. Dates. Dollar amounts. Signature inconsistencies. I wasn't thinking about the porch. I was thinking about ratios. By Wednesday, rumors had started circulating in industry circles. Lenders were tightening. Vendors were asking questions. Daniel called that evening. Routine compliance review, he said quickly. Before I could speak. Standard stuff. Okay, I replied. There was a pause. You wouldn't know anything about that. Would you? He asked. Voice carefully neutral. I'm doing my job, I said. His tone sharpened. Be careful. Custody agreements can be revisited if circumstances change. There it was. The old tactic. Pressure through our son. I didn't rise to it. I'll have my attorney reach out if there are concerns, I said calmly. After we hung up, I documented the call and forwarded a summary to my lawyer. Fear used to make me reactive. Now it made me methodical. 2 days later, Melissa contacted me. Her voice trembled slightly. I found loan documents, she said. Against our house. I didn't know. I closed my eyes briefly. How exposed is he? She asked. I can't discuss specifics, I replied. But you should speak to independent counsel immediately. Silence lingered on the line. He said you were unstable. She whispered. I'm not, I said quietly. When I returned to the files on my desk, I noticed something that made my pulse steady instead of spike. Several vendor guarantees bore signatures that mirrored the forged pattern from years ago. The spacing was off. The pressure inconsistent. Subtle. But visible if you knew what to look for. This wasn't just aggressive growth. It was structural risk. By the following week, federal auditors requested deeper documentation from multiple firms. Daniel's company wasn't named publicly, but shared vendors meant scrutiny was inevitable. Industry chatter turned cautious. Investors became nervous. Credit lines tightened. Harold called me into his office again. Primary lender may call in a major note, he said. If that happens, forced restructuring is likely. Restructuring. I thought of the guarantee agreement with my name on it from years earlier. The way I had signed without reading. The way he had assumed I never would. That night, Daniel requested to meet in person to discuss co-parenting. We met in a neutral office building lobby in Dallas. He looked tired, not defeated, but thinner around the edges. This audit is exaggerated, he said. Competitors stirring trouble. I didn't argue. You need to publicly distance yourself, he continued. Say you're not involved in any of this. I'm not, I said. I review accounts. That's my job. His jaw tightened. You think you're smarter than me now? No, I replied evenly. I just understand the numbers. For a second, the confidence that once filled him flickered. As I drove home, I realized something that would have terrified me years earlier. If his company collapsed, child support could destabilize. My son's security mattered more than pride. I called my attorney and discussed protective measures. Securing arrears. Establishing structured safeguards in case of bankruptcy. Strategy, not emotion. By the end of the month, rumors solidified into fact. Daniel's primary lender was considering calling in a substantial loan tied to his largest development. If triggered, the structure would strain under its own weight. Years ago, he believed locking me out protected his empire from my questions. Now the very architecture he built without transparency was threatening to close in on him. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt prepared. The night he slid that deadbolt into place, he thought he was securing his future. He didn't realize he had already started loosening its foundation. Daniel called close to midnight. And for the first time since I had known him, his voice didn't sound controlled. I need to talk to you, he said. In person. It's about Ethan's future. He didn't say please. He didn't have to. The strain in his tone said enough. We agreed to meet 2 days later in a private conference room inside a commercial office building in Dallas. Neutral ground. Business hours. When I walked in, he was already there. He looked older. Not dramatically, just worn. His phone kept lighting up on the table in front of him. Screen flashing with notifications he pretended not to see. Thanks for coming, he said, standing halfway before sitting again. I placed my folder on the table and took the seat across from him. What's going on? I asked. He exhaled slowly. My primary lender is considering calling the note on the Riverside project, he said. If that happens, everything tightens. Vendors panic. Investors pull back. It becomes a spiral. He paused, watching my face for reaction. I need restructuring consultation, he continued. Independent. Credible. Your firm has connections. There it was. Not an apology. Not regret. A request. For Ethan, he added quickly. If this company destabilizes, that affects support. Stability matters. He was right about one thing. Stability did matter. I folded my hands calmly on the table. My firm doesn't take cases without full transparency, I said. Complete financial disclosure. Debt structure. Vendor obligations. Personal guarantees. His jaw tightened. You'd have access to everything. Yes. He hesitated. Calculating risk. I can manage this, he said defensively. It's just timing. If that were true, I replied evenly. We wouldn't be having this conversation. Silence filled the room. He leaned forward. What do you want? He asked. I met his eyes without flinching. I want formal restructuring under creditor oversight, I said. I want my name fully removed from any residual liability tied to past guarantees. I want secured child support structured in advance through protected accounts. And I want documentation of every outstanding loan. His expression shifted from irritation to disbelief. You're leveraging this, he said. No, I corrected. I'm protecting my son. He let out a short, humorless laugh. You always thought I was hiding something. You were, I said quietly. His phone buzzed again. He ignored it. There's something else, I continued. Your largest secondary note was recently acquired. He looked up sharply. By who? A holding entity affiliated with my firm. The words settled heavily between us. His face went still. You bought my debt? He asked. Disbelief edging into anger. My firm invested in distressed assets with high recovery potential, I replied. Yours qualified. You orchestrated this. I didn't create the exposure, I said calmly. I just understood it. He stood abruptly, pacing once before stopping near the window. You could destroy me, he said. I considered that. Yes. I could push for aggressive enforcement. Asset seizure. Public collapse. I had the leverage. But destruction wasn't the goal anymore. If you fall, I said steadily, Ethan absorbs the shock too. That's not revenge. That's collateral damage. He turned to face me fully then. So what is this? He demanded. Accountability, I said. Structure. Oversight. The same transparency you denied me. He stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. Years ago, I had stood outside a locked door with $38 in my purse. I had felt small, dependent, replaceable. Now I held contracts that determined the survival of his company. Why didn't you just destroy me? He asked quietly. Because I'm not you. I thought aloud. I said, because power isn't about burning something down. It's about deciding what survives. Within weeks, restructuring negotiations began under formal supervision. Creditors imposed conditions. Operational authority shifted to a board controlled largely by investors. Daniel retained a role, but he no longer controlled everything. When we met one final time to sign the restructuring documents, he looked at the contract in front of him, then at me. You came back, he said softly. I shook my head. No, I replied. I moved forward. As I left the building, the weight in my chest felt different than I expected. Not triumph. Not bitterness. Just balance. The night he locked me out, he believed I would return begging at that door. He never imagined I would walk back into his world holding the terms. 1 year after the restructuring agreement was signed, my name was etched in glass on the door of my own firm in downtown Dallas. Hail Financial Recovery. The letters caught the morning light as I unlocked the office and stepped inside. The floors were polished. The walls were lined with framed certifications and client testimonials. There was no flickering porch light here. No locked doors. No waiting for permission. Most of my clients were women. Single mothers navigating divorce. Wives discovering hidden debt. Women who had been told they were bad with money until they realized the truth had simply been withheld from them. I didn't advertise revenge. I advertised clarity. Daniel's company still existed. The restructuring had stabilized vendor payments and prevented collapse. But he no longer held majority control. A board now reviewed major decisions. Lenders required transparency. Credit exposure was monitored. He was still employed, still respected in certain circles. But the unchecked empire he once guarded so fiercely no longer belonged solely to him. Consequences, I learned, do not always look like ruin. Sometimes they look like limitation. One afternoon, I sat at my desk reviewing a new client's financial affidavit while my assistant scheduled a workshop on protecting credit during divorce. Outside the window, Dallas traffic moved in steady lines. purposeful and unbothered. My son, Ethan, was 8 now, tall for his age, curious. He liked to sit at the kitchen table in the evenings and ask questions about numbers. "What's a budget?" he asked once, pencil tapping against his math worksheet. "It's a plan," I told him. "It's how you decide what stays and what goes." He nodded as if that made perfect sense. Through the restructuring negotiations, I had secured something that mattered more than leverage: a protected educational trust in his name, structured support safeguarded before any future instability could touch it. Years earlier, he had been used as pressure, a bargaining chip in custody threats. Now he was shielded by contracts I understood. That was the real empire. Not buildings, not revenue. Protection. I saw Daniel occasionally at school events. We stood on opposite sides of auditoriums, clapping politely during award ceremonies. One afternoon after a science fair, he approached me quietly. "You built something real," he said. There was no sarcasm in his voice. "I had to," I replied. He nodded once. No defensiveness, no superiority, just acknowledgement. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the girl who had stood barefoot on cold concrete with $38 in her purse, believing the future had just slammed shut. I could still feel the texture of that porch under my feet, still hear the click of the lock. Back then, I thought the worst thing that could happen to a woman was being left outside. I was wrong. The worst thing is never learning why you were put there. Understanding money changed everything for me. Not because it made me powerful in some dramatic way, but because it removed fear. Betrayal forced me to look at contracts, at guarantees, at the language men sometimes hide behind. And once I understood it, I stopped being afraid of it. He thought locking me out would make me dependent. It forced me to become disciplined. He thought financial control was love. It taught me that knowledge is freedom. He thought I would come back begging at that door. He didn't realize he was closing his control and opening my empire. If you've ever been told you don't understand money, or that you should just trust someone else to handle it, I want you to know something. You are not incapable. You are uninformed by design. And that can change. If any part of this story felt familiar, if you've faced betrayal, manipulation, or felt excluded from decisions that shaped your own future, I'd love to hear about it. Share your experience in the comments. Your story might be the turning point for someone else reading it. And if you want more stories about women reclaiming their power, navigating family drama, and watching the tables turn through strategy instead of chaos, stay here with me. Subscribe. Follow along. There are more chapters like this. And sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destruction. It's transformation. The night he smiled through that locked door, he believed he had cut off my future. He never imagined that very night would build my empire.